Chapter 1. The shears snapped with a metal-sharp finality, severing a cluster of overripe mint stalks. Saffron Thorne did not look up from the dirt. She focused instead on the pungent, sharp scent that rose from the bruised leaves, a fragrance so aggressive it seemed to scrub the very air. She worked with a frantic precision, deadheading the mint not to encourage new growth, but to maintain a perimeter of scent so oppressive it functioned as a wall. In the damp soil of the library garden, the mint was a green tide, surging against the curated borders of the village's prestige. Saffron knelt in the loam, her skirts already stained a deep, earthy ochre, her fingers blackened at the tips. This was her fortress, a sanctuary where the only expectations were the seasonal rhythms of the soil and the silent demands of the perennials. From the periphery of her vision, the village elite drifted past the iron gates like pale ghosts. She watched them, the daughters of merchants in their stiff muslin, the matrons with their powdered faces, and noted the way they instinctively veered away from the widow's patch. They treated the garden as a site of contagion, as if her mourning were a blight that could leap from the mint to their silk hems. Saffron welcomed the distance. Invisibility was a luxury she had cultivated as carefully as her rare orchids. To be forgotten by the ton was to be free from the performative grief they expected of a widow, the curated size and the precise duration of black crepe. Here, amidst the damp earth and the smell of crushed herbs, she did not have to be a cautionary tale of loss. She was simply a part of the undergrowth. The rhythmic snap of her shears was suddenly severed by a different sound, the sharp, metronomic tapping of a fan against a palm. Saffron froze. The sound was a percussion of power, a signal of arrival that required no announcement. She did not need to lift her gaze to know that the silence of her sanctuary had been breached. The air shifted, the scent of damp earth suddenly warring with a cloying, artificial cloud of night-bloom scent and expensive powder. Beatrix Sterling stepped into the garden, her skirts trailing over the damp earth with a deliberate lack of caution. Each step was a calculated intrusion, the heavy silk of her gown brushing against the mint, flattening the very stems Saffron had spent the morning tending. Beatrix did not look at the plants. She studied Saffron as one might look at a smudge on a piece of fine porcelain. She stopped a mere foot from Saffron's kneeling form, the tip of her fan poised like a weapon. The rhythmic tapping ceased, replaced by a stillness that felt like a held breath before a blow. "The state of these grounds is quite extraordinary, is it not?" Beatrix began, her voice a polished blade of forced kindness. "One almost forgets that a library is intended to be a beacon of civilization, rather than a wilderness of aromatic weeds. It is a curious choice, Saffron, to cultivate a garden that smells so pointedly of a kitchen pantry." Saffron felt the familiar constriction in her throat, a physical tightening that turned her words into stones. She gripped the shears tightly, her knuckles white against the rusted metal. She wanted to explain that the mint was a shield, that the sharpness of the scent drowned out the hollow silence of her own house, but the words remained locked behind a wall of social terror. Instead, she tugged at her apron strings, her eyes fixed on the dirt. The soil requires a balance," Saffron managed, her voice thin and wavering. "The mint, it anchors the perimeter. If one disturbs the root systems too abruptly, the entire structure of the bed collapses. The perennials depend on the stability of the undergrowth." Beatrix tilted her head, a slight, judgmental movement that suggested she found the botanical explanation quaintly irrelevant. Stability is a virtue, certainly, but it must not be confused with stagnation. The library has long been a neglected relic, a crumbling testament to a past that no longer serves our current standing. As the primary patron, I have decided that a modern restoration is imperative. We shall replace these haphazard patches with a formal French parterre, symmetrical, disciplined, and reflective of the prestige this village deserves. Saffron's heart gave a sharp, irregular thud. A French parterre meant the erasure of everything she had built. It meant the removal of the wild corners where the grease shadows lived, the replacement of her intuitive sanctuary with a curated exhibition of wealth. The autonomy she had clawed back from the ruins of her marriage was being stripped away in a single, clipped sentence. She looked up then, her eyes meeting Beatrix's cold, calculating gaze. She tried to find a word, a plea, a protest, a demand, but the social hierarchy of the village acted as a muzzle. She was a widow of modest means. Beatrix was the architect of the village's social order. She is erasing me, Saffron thought, the realization spiking through her like a needle. She isn't just pruning the garden, she is pruning my existence from the map of this town. To her, I am a weed in a formal garden, a remnant of a tragedy that disrupts the symmetry of her curated world. If the garden goes, where do I go? I have spent 3 years building a wall of green, and she has walked through it as if it were smoke. Beatrix smiled, though the expression that stayed cold. I trust you understand the necessity of this transition. A woman of your precarious standing should be grateful for the patronage that keeps these halls open. It would be a pity if the library were to close entirely due to a lack of aesthetic appeal. You may continue to assist with the transition, provided you can follow a proper blueprint. Without waiting for a response, Beatrix turned on her heel. As she pivoted, her heavy leather shoe landed squarely on a fresh sprig of mint. Saffron watched in slow motion as the stem snapped and the leaves were ground into the mud, the vibrant green crushed into a dull, bruised gray. The sensory shock of it, the smell of the broken plant rising in a sudden, violent burst, felt like a physical blow to Saffron's chest. Beatrix drifted away, her skirt sweeping the earth, leaving behind a trail of flattened herbs and a vacuum of silence. Saffron remained on her knees for a long time, staring at the crushed sprig. The fortress had been breached. The invisibility she had relied upon was no longer a shield, but a vulnerability. She felt a sudden, desperate need to be inside, away from the open air and the judgment of the sky. She stood slowly, her muscles stiff, and wiped her blackened hands on her apron, though the soil only smeared further into the fabric. She retreated toward the heavy oak doors of the library, the sanctuary of the archives. She expected the doors to be locked, as they usually were, during the midday lull, providing her with a private space to breathe among the scent of old vellum and dust. But as she reached for the iron handle, the door yielded with a heavy, echoing creak. It was already unlocked. Saffron stepped into the dim, cool air of the main hall, the silence of the interior pressing against her ears. She moved toward the central reading table, the heart of the archive, but stopped short. Resting on the scarred mahogany surface was an object that did not belong, a large, weathered leather satchel, its straps worn to a pale tan, smelling of old ink and distant travel. Beside it lay a pair of glasses, and a stack of handwritten notes in a script she didn't recognize, but which looked meticulously, obsessively organized. The library was no longer her private ruin. Someone had already moved in. Chapter 2. The ledger was a liar, and Hassan al-Rashid was not a man who tolerated inaccuracies. He stood in the center of the library's main hall, the air thick with the smell of damp limestone and the slow, acidic rot of neglected vellum. He held the volume open with 2 fingers, as if it were a contaminated specimen, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. "Preposterous," he said, his voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceiling. To list the acquisitions of 1812 as miscellaneous is not merely an oversight, it is a scholarly crime. One does not simply categorize a first-edition translation of Al-Farabi as miscellaneous. He looked around the room. The archives were in a state of elegant collapse. Shelves leaned at precarious angles, and a single shaft of sunlight illuminated a million dancing motes of dust that seemed to mock his desire for order. He had spent a decade in the great libraries of Europe and the East, mastering the art of paleography and the patience of the scribe, only to return to his childhood home and find the record of its intellect reduced to a series of smudge marks and vague summaries. He felt a surge of academic indignation that vibrated in his chest. He wanted to scrub the walls, to reindex every scroll, to breathe life back into the silent, decaying ghosts of the stacks. But the chaos was suffocating. He needed air, and he needed it before he succumbed to the urge to scream at a book. He pushed through the heavy oak doors, the iron hinges groaning in protest, and stepped out into the garden. The transition was violent. He moved from the monochrome gloom of the archives into a riot of green and gold that felt almost intrusive in its vibrancy. He stopped mid-stride. 10 paces away, a woman stood among the borders. She was dressed in a faded gown of muted gray, her apron stained with the honest, dark loam of the earth. She was bent over a patch of soil, her movements slow and rhythmic, almost liturgical. Hassan froze. The academic detachment he had cultivated like a shield, the formal distance of the scholar shattered. The woman turned slightly, and the light caught the profile of a face he had spent years trying to reconstruct from memory. "Saffron?" he whispered. The name felt strange in his throat, a word from a forgotten language. Saffron did not jump, she merely stilled. She did not look up immediately, her gaze remaining fixed on the soil. She tugged at the string of her apron, a small, nervous gesture that Hassan recognized with a jolt of electricity. It was the same habit she had possessed at 12, when they had hidden in the hollow of an old oak to read forbidden poetry. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon the polished cadence of a gentleman, but his voice wavered. Saffron Thorn, I had heard you remained here, but the reports were vague. It has been a very long time. Saffron finally looked at him, though her eyes did not quite meet his. She focused instead on the bridge of his nose, or perhaps his glasses. She said nothing. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the ghosts of childhood promises and the vast, yawning gap of a decade's absence. She shifted her weight, her fingers curling around a dried, brown seed pod she had been inspecting. She held it like a talisman, a wall of organic matter between her and the man who had returned from the world. Hassan felt a sudden, desperate need to bridge the distance, yet he found himself paralyzed by the propriety of the moment. He was a man of letters, yet he found himself without a single sentence that did not feel clumsy. He looked away, his gaze wandering to the corner of the garden, where a small, sheltered alcove of stone protected a single, stubborn bloom. It was a pale, iridescent blue, its petals curling inward like a secret. He stopped breathing. He moved closer, his voice softening, losing its formal edge. "The gentianus," he murmured. "The spring gentian. I remember the day we planted the seeds. You told me that if we whispered to them, they would grow faster because they liked the sound of secrets." Saffron's shoulders dropped an inch. She studied the flower, and for a fleeting second, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. Not a smile of joy, but of shared recognition. The blue of the flower was an exact match for the ink they had used to map out their imaginary kingdom as children. For a moment, the years collapsed. They were no longer a grieving widow and a foreign scholar. They were two children in a world that had not yet told them how to be lonely. "They do not like secrets," Saffron said, her voice soft and rhythmic, like the rustle of wind through dry corn. "They like the shade and the silence." "A preference I can appreciate," Hassan replied, his voice barely audible. Mr. San replied, "Al-Rashid." The voice sliced through the intimacy like a blade. They both turned to see Beatrix Sterling gliding toward them, her silk skirt sweeping the gravel with a rhythmic, predatory hiss. She held a folding fan closed in her hand, tapping it against her palm in a steady, hypnotic beat. She did not look at Saffron, she looked through her, as if the woman were merely a particularly dull piece of shrubbery. "I trust you have found the archives to your liking, Hassan," Beatrix said, her voice a steady and forced kindness. She stopped beside him, the scent of heavy, cloying lily-of-the-valley trailing after her. "Though I suspect you find the current state of the ledgers challenging. It is a pity that the previous administration was so lax with the accounts." Hassan straightened, his academic posture returning. "Indeed, Mrs. Sterling, the lack of organization is systemic. I believe a complete audit and a revised budget for preservation materials are necessary if we are to save the collection." Beatrix's fan stopped tapping. She tilted her head, a small, judgmental movement. "Budget," she repeated, the word sounding like a curiosity. "Yes, the financial aspect. I have taken the liberty of reviewing the library's endowment. In the interest of efficiency, I have redirected the restoration funds into a discretionary account. It is, of course, managed personally by me. This ensures that no one spends the funds on frivolous academic whims." Hassan blinked. "Redirected?" "But the grants were specifically earmarked for the restoration of the vellum and the repair of the shelving." "They were," Beatrix said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "And they shall be dispensed at my discretion. You will find your salary is quite comfortable, Hassan, provided your work aligns with the aesthetic and social goals I have set for the library. I expect a sanctuary of beauty, not a dusty warehouse of obsolete thoughts. Should your priorities diverge from mine, I fear your tenure here would be remarkably brief." She leaned in slightly, the threat veiled in a velvet tone. "I am the patron, Mr. Al-Rashid. The library exists because I allow it to exist. I trust we understand one another." Hassan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He studied the crumbling walls of the library, then at the fragile blue gentian, and finally at Saffron, who had retreated back into her silence, her gaze once again fixed on the earth. He had traveled thousands of miles to save these books, only to discover that he had been hired as a curator for a gilded cage, and the key was held by a woman who viewed knowledge as a mere accessory to her status. Chapter 3. Saffron's fingers trembled. the stems of the yellow roses bruising under her grip as she bound them with a length of coarse twine. She worked with a frantic, imprecise energy, her breath hitching in the humid air of the potting shed. In the language of her father's gardens, these were not merely flowers, they were a bridge. Yellow, not the gold of wealth or the crimson of passion, but the steady, quiet hue of friendship. It was a gesture of peace, a silent apology for her retreat in the presence of Mrs. Sterling, and a tentative hand extended to the boy who had once read her poetry beneath the willow trees. She glanced toward the library, where the gray stone walls seemed to lean inward, burdened by the weight of 1,000 decaying spines. The risk was a physical weight in her chest. To leave a gift was to acknowledge a bond, and in the rigid geography of their village, any acknowledgement was a vulnerability. Yet, the silence between her and Hassan had become a void she could no longer endure. She stepped across the damp grass, her boots clicking softly on the stone path, and slipped into the archive hall. The air inside smelled of old vellum and the sharp tang of dampness. Hassan was absent, likely sequestered in the upper galleries or arguing with a ledger, leaving the main desk a sanctuary of mahogany and dust. Saffron placed the bouquet exactly where he would see it, resting atop a stack of linen-bound folios, and vanished back into the garden before the echo of her footsteps could betray her. When Hassan returned, he did not see a gift, he saw a cipher. He stopped short, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he stared at the vibrant yellow petals contrasting against the muted brown of the desk. His academic mind, trained in the rigorous discipline of paleography, instinctively sought a key. He did not simply smell the roses, he analyzed them. He noted the saturation of the pigment and the precise arrangement of the petals. He stepped away from the desk and crossed to a nearby shelf, pulling down a weathered copy of The Botanist's Lexicon. He flipped through the pages with surgical precision, his finger tracing the entries until he found the section on rosaceae. He lingered on the passage regarding the yellow rose, reading the definition of platonic affection and friendship twice. He looked from the book to the flowers, a small perplexed frown creasing his brow. He wondered if the gesture was a simple courtesy or a coded message regarding the library's state. To Hassan, the world was a series of texts to be decoded, and Saffron Thorn was the most complex manuscript he had ever encountered. An hour later, he found her in the courtyard struggling with a heavy burlap sack of potting soil. The bag was oversized and leaking a fine mist of peat that clung to the damp fabric of her skirts. Saffron was leaning back, her heels digging into the soft loam, her face flushed with a concentrated effort that bordered on desperation. She refused to ask for help, her jaw set in a line of stubborn autonomy that Hassan recognized from their childhood. "The physics of the lift are against you, Saffron," Hassan said, his voice sounding too formal, too much like a lecture hall, even as his heart performed a clumsy dance in his chest. Saffron didn't look up, though her grip tightened on the burlap. "I am quite capable of managing a bag of earth, Mr. Al-Rashid." "Capability is distinct from efficiency," he replied, stepping closer. He reached down, his movements hesitant. As he grasped the other end of the heavy sack, his knuckles brushed against the rough weave of the burlap, and for a fleeting second his fingers grazed the back of her hand. The contact was electric, a sudden spark that seemed to vibrate through the humid air. Saffron froze, her breath catching in a sharp, audible hitch. Neither of them moved for a heartbeat, the weight of the soil suspended between them. Hassan felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to close the gap, to speak a truth that had been dormant for a decade, but the ghost of Mrs. Eclower. Sterling's presence seemed to linger in the periphery of the courtyard, a reminder of the social precipice upon which they stood. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant chime of the village clock. She stepped back quickly, the sudden distance feeling like a physical loss. Hassan cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "It is a significant amount of soil. I imagine the gentians will appreciate the richness." He wanted to say more, to ask if the roses were meant for him, to tell her that he had spent the last hour reading a textbook just to understand her. But the words remained locked behind his academic reserve. He watched her retreat toward the flower beds, her posture guarded, her fingers tugging rhythmically at her apron strings. Seeking refuge from his own restlessness, Hassan returned to the archives. He spent the afternoon diving into the estate records of the village, searching for the original blueprints of the library's foundation. The room was dim, lit only by the filtered light of a dying afternoon. As he pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume of land grants from the bottom shelf, something fluttered from between the pages. It was a letter, folded into a tight square and sealed with a dollop of dark red wax. The seal had partially cracked over time, the wax brittle and grayed. Hassan hesitated. The letter was not addressed to him, nor to the library. The ink on the envelope was faded, but the name was clear. It was addressed to Julian Thorne, Saffron's late husband. Curiosity, that academic vice, won over propriety. He broke the remaining seal and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was feminine, hurried, and intimate, the ink bleeding in places where the writer had pressed too hard. Hassan scanned the lines, his eyes widening as he read a fragment of a conversation that felt like a violation. The writer spoke of a mounting desperation and a debt that could not be ignored, mentioning a sum of money that far exceeded the modest means of a man like Julian Thorne. There were mentions of a secret arrangement and a price for silence that hinted at a clandestine life Saffron had never known. He read the words again, the implication settling in his gut like cold lead. If these debts were real, and if the scandal mentioned in the letter were to surface, the meager pittance Saffron relied upon, the very autonomy she fought so hard to preserve, could be stripped away in a single stroke of a lawyer's pen. Hassan looked up from the letter to the bouquet of yellow roses still sitting on the mahogany desk. The vibrant color now seemed jarring, almost naive. He thought of Saffron's trembling hands and her fierce, quiet dignity. He realized with a jolt of dread that the bridge she had tried to build with those flowers was anchored in a soil that might be poisoned. He held the letter in his hand, the secret weighing more than the bag of soil he had carried, wondering if the friendship he was rediscovering was merely a fragile veil draped over a ruin. Chapter 4. It is not a subspecies of the S. digitalis, but a divergent variation of the Slinaria, Saffron whispered, her finger hovering a mere fraction of an inch above the yellowed vellum. Hassan leaned in, the scent of old paper and the faint lingering musk of dried pressed flowers enveloping them both. The volume was a behemoth of a book, bound in cracked calfskin that groaned whenever they turned a page. They were tucked into the furthest alcove of the archives, where the light filtered through high, dust-moted windows in long, slanted columns. The air here felt thick, as if the weight of 1,000 dead authors was pressing down on them, creating a sanctuary of silence that existed independently of the village outside. The morphology of the root system suggests otherwise, Hassan countered, his voice low and rhythmic, matching the hushed cadence of the room. He pointed to a meticulous copperplate engraving of a root network that looked like a map of some subterranean city. Look at the lateral spread. Acelinaria would never exhibit such a profound descent into the loam. This is a specimen designed for drought, a survivor of the arid plains. Saffron shifted, her shoulder brushing against his coat. She did not pull away. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the illustration with an intensity that bordered on the devotional. You see the anatomy, Hassan, but you forget the soil. A plant does not merely exist in a vacuum of classification, it responds to the earth it inhabits. If this were grown in the heavy clay of the valley, the roots would be stunted, but in the sandy loam of the coast, they would stretch exactly thus. Without realizing it, Hassan had mirrored her posture. He was leaning forward, his spine curved in the same tentative arc as hers, his breath hitching in time with her own. He felt a sudden sharp awareness of the distance between them, or rather, the lack of it. The academic debate, usually his shield, had become a bridge. He found himself less interested in the Slinaria, and more captivated by the way Saffron's voice softened when she spoke of the earth, as if she were sharing a secret meant only for the plants. Perhaps, he conceded, his voice dropping an octave, the environment dictates the form more than the lineage. Saffron turned her head slightly. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for a sign of genuine agreement or mere politeness. In the dim light, the amber flecks in her irises seemed to glow. The silence between them stretched, no longer the silence of a library, but something taut and vibrating. Saffron reached out to trace the line of the root system once more, and Hassan's hand moved instinctively to steady the page. Their fingers collided. It was a small contact, the slide of skin against skin on the cool, textured surface of the vellum, but it felt like a thunderclap in the stillness of the archives. Neither of them moved. Hassan felt the warmth of her hand, a stark contrast to the chill of the room. For several heartbeats, the world narrowed down to that single point of contact. The debt he had discovered in the letter, the looming threat of Beatrix Sterling, the rigid expectations of their station. All of it vanished. There was only the scent of old ink and the electric, terrifying proximity of a woman who had spent years hiding in the shadows of her own garden. Oh, what a delightfully rustic scene. The voice sliced through the moment like a blade. Both Hassan and Saffron recoiled as if they had been burned, their hands snapping back to their respective sides. Farah Okoro stood at the entrance of the alcove, her posture a masterclass in performative grace. She was draped in a gown of pale primrose silk that seemed entirely too bright for the gloom of the library, her skirts billowing around her like a curated cloud. In her hand, she held a small, leather-bound social diary and a graphite pencil, which she held poised like a weapon. "Miss Farah," Hassan said, his voice suddenly stiff and formal, his hand flying to adjust his glasses. He stepped instinctively in front of Saffron, as if his physical presence could shield her from the other woman's scrutinizing gaze. "I was not aware you had an interest in botanical classification." Farah did not look at him. Her eyes were darting between Saffron's flushed face and the proximity of their chairs, her gaze calculating and cold. She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she began to scribble rapidly in her diary, the pencil scratching a rhythmic, aggressive sound against the paper. She tilted her head, a small, thin smile playing on her lips, a smile that stayed cold. Saffron had retreated. She had shrunk back into her shell, her fingers tugging violently at the strings of her apron, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. The vulnerability that had just existed between her and Hassan was gone, replaced by a palpable, shivering anxiety. "Interest? My dear Mr. Stir." "Al-Rashid, I have very little interest in the dirt," Farah replied, her voice airy and fluctuating in pitch, mimicking the latest affectations of the London season. "However, I have a profound interest in the dynamics of the village. It is so rare to see a widow of such modest circumstances spending so much intimate time in the company of a scholar. One wonders if the archives offer more than just old books." "We are discussing the morphology of this linaria," Hassan stated, his tone clipped. He felt a surge of protective irritation. "A pursuit of purely academic merit." "I trust you find the pursuit of knowledge a worthy endeavor, Miss Okoro." Farah gave a soft, melodic laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Of course. Knowledge is a powerful tool, especially when one is seeking to secure a new form of patronage. I shall be sure to note the intensity of your collaboration." She stepped closer, the scent of an overbearing artificial violet perfume filling the space. She didn't speak another word to them, but her eyes remained fixed on Saffron, documenting every tremor of the widow's hands. With a final, predatory glance, Farah turned on her heel and swept out of the alcove, the rustle of her silk skirts sounding like a warning. As she departed, a small piece of white lace fluttered to the floor, a scented handkerchief, left behind with an air of calculated negligence. But as Saffron exhaled, a shaky, jagged breath, she noticed something else. Farah had not simply dropped a handkerchief. She had left her diary open on the mahogany table beside them, the pages splayed wide. Saffron leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, on the open page, was a quick charcoal sketch. It was an unnervingly accurate rendering of her and Hassan hunched together over the book, their heads nearly touching, their silhouettes blurred in a way that suggested a scandalous intimacy. Beneath the sketch, in a sharp, looping script, were 4 words that made the blood drain from Saffron's face. The scandal of the archives. Chapter 5. The soil was cold and damp, clinging to Saffron's fingernails like a second skin, but she did not mind the grit. She worked in the center of the main garden bed, her movements precise and rhythmic, carving a shallow cradle into the earth for the Esmiosotis sylvatica. To the untrained eye, it was a mere forget-me-not, a common blue speck amidst the greenery. But Saffron had chosen this specific variety for its depth of hue and the clandestine promise it carried. In the silent lexicon of the garden, she was planting a seed of secret love, a bold floral declaration that felt, in the stillness of the morning, like a shout in a cathedral. She spent the better part of 2 hours meticulously masking the bloom. She arranged a screen of common hostas and trailing ivy around the perimeter, creating a living veil. The goal was not to hide the flower from the world entirely, but to ensure it remained invisible to those who looked only at the surface. Only someone with a scholar's eye for detail, someone who understood the patience of growth in the architecture of a leaf, would notice the deliberate gap in the greenery. Only Hassan would find it. As she pressed the last handful of loam firm, Saffron felt a strange, fluttering lightness in her chest, a sensation that threatened to override her usual caution. For a woman whose life had become a study in erasure, this small act of visibility felt like a revolution. "You are digging with a fervor that suggests you are burying a body, or perhaps planting a kingdom." A melodic voice drifted across the hedge. Saffron jolted, her hand slipping in the mud. She looked up to see Nalini Deshmukh leaning against the wrought-iron gate, her silk shawl draped with an effortless grace that always made Saffron feel as though she were made of coarse wool. Nalini's smile was a knowing thing, the kind of expression that suggested she had already read the ending of a book Saffron had only just begun to write. "I am merely tending to the perennials, Nalini," Saffron replied, though her voice lacked its usual steadiness. She wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric already stained with the dark evidence of her mourning. "The soil is particularly receptive today." Nalini stepped into the garden, her boots clicking softly on the stone path. She didn't look at the larger beds. Instead, her eyes tracked the sheltered spot where Saffron had just finished. "The soil is always receptive to those who speak its language. Tell me, is this a conversation for the public or a private correspondence?" Saffron paused, her gaze drifting to the blue petals peeking through the ivy. A soft, rhythmic hope entered her tone, her words slowing as she sought the exact phrasing. "It is a tentative inquiry. A way to signal that the silence between us is no longer a void, but a bridge. I wanted to tell him that I remember the way he used to describe the stars, and that I find the archives more welcoming since his return." Nalini laughed, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the gray Regency morning. "My dear Saffron, you are a master of the subtle, but do not let subtlety become a cage. The world is far too loud for whispers alone. Be bolder. If you wish to claim a place in his heart, you must eventually step out from behind the hostas. Happiness is a predatory thing. If you do not seize it, someone else, someone far less deserving, will surely take it from you." Saffron looked down at her muddied boots, the weight of propriety pressing back down upon her. "I cannot simply be bold. The village has a memory like a ledger, Nalini. Every transgression is recorded, and the interest is paid in reputation." "Then let them keep their ledgers," Nalini countered, her hand resting lightly on Saffron's shoulder. "There is a profound dignity in choosing one's own joy over the approval of people who view a garden as a mere accessory to a house. Your heart is not a curated exhibition, Saffron. Let it be wild." For a moment the two women stood in a shared, comfortable silence, the air smelling of damp earth and the faint, lingering scent of the rain that had passed overnight. Saffron felt a rare surge of confidence, a belief that the secret love bloom would serve as a beacon, drawing Hassan toward her in a way that words never could. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of quiet anticipation, imagining the moment his glasses would catch the shade of blue, the moment he would realize that the garden was speaking to him. When Saffron returned to the garden the following morning, the mist was still clinging to the grass in silver threads. She walked with a light step, her mind already composing the conversation she hoped would follow the discovery of the flower. But as she reached the center bed, the lightness vanished, her breath hitched. The Myosotis sylvatica had not merely wilted, it had been obliterated. The plant had been violently ripped from the soil, the roots exposed and shriveled like skeletal fingers. The delicate blue petals were no longer a beacon, they were crushed into the dark, clinging mud, trampled by a heavy heel into a bruised, unrecognizable pulp. The ivy screen she had so carefully constructed had been torn aside, leaving the site of her confession exposed and violated. Saffron sank to her knees, her fingers trembling as she touched the ruined stem. A sharp, jagged feeling of exposure washed over her, as if someone had reached into her chest and stepped on her heart. This was not the work of a stray dog or a sudden frost. This was a calculated act of erasure. The vulnerability she had allowed herself to feel the day before now felt like a liability, a wound left open for the world to see. She began to search the mud, her movements frantic, searching for any sign of who had done this. Her fingers brushed against something coarse and unnatural. Hooked deep into the remaining thorns of a nearby rosebush was a small, distinct scrap of white lace. Saffron pulled it free, the fabric delicate and expensive, featuring an intricate floral pattern that was far too costly for any servant or village girl to possess. Saffron's blood ran cold. She recognized that specific lace. It was the same trim that adorned the high collars and cuffs of Lady Beatrix Sterling's favorite morning gowns. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was not a random act of vandalism, it was a warning. Beatrix had not only seen the flower, she had seen the intent behind it. The message was clear. Saffron's private heart was under surveillance, and any attempt to cultivate a life beyond the boundaries of her station would be met with absolute destruction. Saffron remained on her knees, the scrap of lace clutched in her hand, feeling the sudden, oppressive weight of the village closing in around her. The garden, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. It really is a shame about the blue ones. A voice drifted from the edge of the garden, airy and fluctuating in pitch. They are such a fragile species. One wrong step, and they simply vanish. Saffron froze and turned slowly. Standing at the perimeter of the garden, framed by the gray stone wall, was Farah Okoro. She was dressed in a gown of pale primrose, her skirts perfectly smoothed, her posture a study in performative elegance. She didn't move closer, but her eyes, cold, sharp, and glittering with a predatory triumph, remained fixed on Saffron. Farah didn't smile with her lips, but her gaze held the satisfaction of a hunter who had just watched a trap snap shut. She lingered for a heartbeat longer, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a threat, and then, with a flick of her wrist, she turned and swept away, the rustle of her silk skirts sounding like the closing of a cell door. Chapter 6. The scent of ambergris and heavy lilies clung to the library's great hall, a cloying mixture that felt less like a celebration and more like a burial. Saffron stood by the mahogany wainscoting, twisting the fabric of her charcoal silk gown, a dress 5 years out of fashion and tight across the shoulders. She felt the gaze of the village elite sliding over her like a cold current, weighing her frayed hem against their shimmering satins. To them she was a ghost haunting her own life, a widow present only by the grace of the patroness. Across the room candlelight flickered in the crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows that mocked Saffron's stillness. She focused on a potted fern in the corner, noting the yellowing of the lower fronds, a sign of overwatering. It was a small, botanical failure, but the only thing in the room she felt qualified to judge. The air was thick with the snap of fans and the hum of conversations that shifted into a vacuum of silence the moment she stepped within earshot. Lady Beatrix Sterling moved toward the center of the room, the crowd parting with military precision. Draped in iridescent cream, her waist cinched to an improbable degree, she tapped a painted fan rhythmically against her palm. 3 short strikes. A silence. 3 more. It was the sound of a gavel in a courtroom where Beatrix was the sole judge, jury, and executioner. "Pray, lend me your attention," Beatrix announced, her voice a polished, artificial warmth. She stepped onto the small dais, her gaze landing with surgical precision on Saffron. "We gather tonight not merely to celebrate the restoration of our archives, but to honor the civilizing influence a well-curated library brings to a provincial outpost. Knowledge, after all, is a mirror. It reflects not only the wisdom of the ancients, but the order and propriety of the society that preserves it." Saffron felt a sharp prickle of heat climb her neck. She looked down at her scuffed leather shoes. The speech was a performance of virtue, but the subtext was a reminder of who held the keys to the kingdom. The guests remained breathless, waiting for the inevitable turn of the screw. "In the spirit of this renewed order," Beatrix continued, her tone shifting to exaggerated charity, "I have reflected on the logistical inefficiencies of our current arrangement. The gardener's quarters, while quaint, are poorly situated. To ensure a more streamlined operation, and to relieve the burden of isolation from our dear Mrs. Thorne, I have decided that the gardening staff and their residents shall be moved to the servants' wing adjacent to the kitchens. I believe Saffron will find the proximity to the domestic staff quite comforting." The silence that followed was absolute, the silence of a social execution. To move Saffron from her independent cottage to the servants' wing was a formal demotion of caste. It was a public declaration that Saffron Thorne was no longer a lady of the village, however impoverished, but a mere employee of the Sterling estate. Saffron froze, her breath hitching. She felt a violent urge to melt into the mahogany walls. Her hands gripped her apron strings, which she had forgotten to remove from her gown, and the patterns of the Persian rug blurred into a kaleidoscope of red and gold. She tried to find some shred of defiance, but her voice had retreated deep into her chest. She could hear the collective intake of breath from the crowd as they leaned in to witness the wreckage of her dignity. "A most sensible arrangement, is it not?" Beatrix asked, her eyes glittering with predatory satisfaction. "It is an absurdity." The voice sliced through the tension like a blade. Saffron looked up to see Hassan al-Rashid stepping forward from the periphery. He had been standing in the shadows, his glasses reflecting the candlelight, looking every bit the detached academic. But as he moved into the light, the passivity vanished. He invaded the space, breaking the invisible circle of the ton with a stride far too confident for a man of his social standing. He stopped a few feet from the dais, his posture rigid. When he turned to Beatrix, his expression was one of clinical observation, as if he were analyzing a flawed manuscript. "Lady Beatrix," Hassan began, his voice formal yet ringing with an intensity that made several guests recoil. While I admire your commitment to efficiency, such a move would be a catastrophic error in scholarly preservation. The archives are not merely piles of parchment, they are living entities, linked to the biological history of this region. Mrs. Bressel. Thorne's expertise in botany is not a service to be managed, but a prerequisite for the library's survival. The chemical compositions of the soil surrounding the archives influence the humidity and acidity of the lower vaults. To remove the gardener from her sanctuary is to sever the intuition required to protect the very texts you claim to cherish. He stepped closer, his voice dropping an octave. To treat the stewardship of the land as a domestic chore is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of knowledge. Saffron's role is not one of servitude, but of indispensable intellectual partnership. Without her, these archives are merely dead skin and ink. To demote her is to degrade the library itself. A collective gasp rippled through the room. To challenge Lady Beatrix in public was a social heresy. To do so using the language of intellectual superiority was an act of war. The hierarchy had been fractured in a single outburst. Saffron looked at Hassan, her heart hammering. She had never seen him like this. Not the hesitant man who spoke in soft queries, but a man who had stepped into the line of fire to shield her using the only weapon he possessed, his mind. Beatrix's face went a dangerous shade of pale, her fan frozen mid-air. The mask of benevolence slipped, revealing a raw, cold fury. She could not respond immediately. The logic of his argument had created a social stalemate she could not dismiss without appearing ignorant of her own library's needs. As the gala wound down and the guests dispersed in a flurry of hushed whispers, Beatrix waited. Once the room had emptied of all but a few stragglers, and as Hassan attempted to move toward Saffron, Beatrix stepped into his path. She reached out, her fingers gripping his sleeve with a strength that belied her delicate frame. She leaned in close, her voice a lethal whisper. "You may fancy yourself a protector of ruins, Mr. Al-Rashid, but you have forgotten that I am the one who decides which ruins are allowed to stand. You have just signed the death warrant of your professional reputation." Chapter 7. Nalini Deshmukh did not enter the village council chamber so much as she occupied it. Her presence a vibrant splash of saffron and indigo against the mahogany gloom. She stood before the council members, 5 men whose faces looked as though they had been carved from the same piece of sour apple, and leaned forward, her hands dancing through the air to punctuate a point about municipal charters. The air in the room smelled of old tobacco and damp wool, a stagnant scent that Nalini seemed to slice through with every rhythmic, melodic sentence. To designate the library as a public sanctuary is not merely an act of civic generosity, Nalini said, her voice carrying a confidence that made the councilmen shift in their heavy oak chairs. It is a legal imperative. By the very terms of the original endowment, the archives were intended for the enlightenment of the citizenry, not as a private trophy for the Sterling estate. To allow a single patron to dictate access is to invite a slow death of the village's own intellectual heritage. Saffron stood by the heavy velvet curtains, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her apron. She watched Nalini navigate the minefield of local bureaucracy with a grace Saffron could never emulate. Every time a councilman attempted to interject with a sputtered remark about Lady Beatrix's generosity, Nalini would pivot, her smile lingering just long enough to make the man feel foolish for questioning a point of law. It was a masterful performance of social chess. When the chairman finally cleared his throat and announced that the sanctuary status was upheld, a sudden, sharp lightness bloomed in Saffron's chest. The library was safe. It was no longer a plaything for Beatrix's whims, but a public trust. In the quiet of her heart, Saffron allowed herself a dangerous thought. Perhaps the sanctuary extended beyond the stone walls of the building. Perhaps the shield Nalini had provided created a space where she and Hassan could finally exist without the shadow of a social death warrant hanging over them. That afternoon, the light in the garden was a pale, buttery gold. Saffron moved through the beds with a focused intensity, her shears clipping only the most precise stems. She was composing a message, a silent confession written in petals and scent. She selected white lilies for purity, sprigs of blue cornflower for hope, and a single daring stem of red camellia to signal a longing that she dared not voice. It was a complex arrangement, a botanical vulnerability that whispered, "I trust you, and I am here." She carefully placed the bouquet in the wide stone sill of the archive window, where the glass was clouded with age and the scent of old vellum leaked through the cracks. Inside the archives, Hassan al-Rashid stopped dead. He saw the flowers from the interior, their colors vivid against the gray stone. But he did not see a gesture of trust. His mind immediately leaped to the letter he had discovered, the jagged evidence of Julian's debts and the clandestine arrangements that could strip Saffron of everything. To Hassan, the white lilies looked like a shroud, the red camellia felt like a warning of a bleeding wound. He read the arrangement not as an invitation, but as a signal of retreat. He convinced himself that Saffron, terrified by the potential exposure of her late husband's secrets, was marking her territory and then withdrawing behind a wall of formality. When Saffron entered the archives 10 minutes later, her spirit buoyant, she found Hassan standing at the far end of the long table. He did not look up. He was meticulously aligning a set of paleographic charts, his movements stiff and mechanical. The warmth that had defined their recent stolen moments had vanished, replaced by a cold academic distance. The council's decision was a victory for the village, Saffron said, her voice soft, searching for a crack in his armor. Indeed, Hassan replied. He did not turn. His voice was a flat line, the formal tone of a man addressing a stranger in a lecture hall. It is a commendable achievement of administrative law. I shall return to the cataloging of the 17th century manuscripts now. If you could ensure the humidity in the lower vault remained stable, I would be most grateful. Saffron froze. The precision of his words felt like a physical barrier. She watched the flowers on the sill, then at the rigid line of his shoulders. The suddenness of the shift left her breathless, a vacuum where her hope had just been. She wanted to reach out, to ask why the air between them had suddenly turned to ice, but the habit of silence was a heavy cloak. She retreated into the shadows of the stacks, her heart sinking with a weight that felt like wet earth. Driven by a restless, aching need to understand the architecture of the library she had spent years tending, Saffron began to explore the restricted shelving in the back of the archives, the areas Beatrix had strictly forbidden. She found a series of heavy, leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked and smelling of cedar and rot. As she flipped through the pages, she didn't find poetry or history, but a ledger of payments. Detailed entries showed that Lady Beatrix had been funding the library's restoration not out of a love for knowledge, but as a targeted investment. There were specific payments made to curators to remove certain volumes, and notes on the redaction of genealogical records. Saffron traced a line of ink that detailed the removal of a family history from the 1840s, a record that contradicted the Sterling family's claim to the ancestral lands of the valley. The realization hit her with a sickening clarity. Beatrix didn't want a library, she wanted a curated narrative. She was paying to erase the truth of the village, scrubbing the archives clean of any fact that threatened her perceived nobility. The library was not a sanctuary, it was a laundry for the Sterling reputation. Saffron stepped out into the garden, the ledgers still echoing in her mind. The world felt fragile, as if the very soil beneath her boots was a lie. She found her father, Balthazar, leaning on his walking stick near the edge of the rose garden. He had been watching her, his weathered face etched with a grim understanding. He saw the tremor in her hands and the haunted look in her eyes, and he knew the library's secrets had finally leaked into her soul. He didn't ask what she had found. He simply looked out over the valley, his voice rough and stripped of all ornament. "You've got that look, Saffron. The look of a person who thinks the truth is a shield. In this village, the truth is just a target." Saffron leaned against a stone pillar, her voice a whisper. "She is erasing us, Father. All of us. She's paying to make the past disappear." Balthazar turned to her, his eyes softening, but his jaw remaining set. He reached out a calloused hand and gripped her shoulder, a rare gesture of physical grounding. He had seen the way she studied Hassan, and he had seen the way the world broke people who dared to feel too much in a place governed by the Sterlings. He wanted to protect her from the crushing weight of a hope that could not be sustained by a widow's meager means. "Listen to me," Balthazar said, his voice heavy with a heartbreaking realism. "You can chase the truth, and you can chase that man, but you must remember where you stand. We are the gardeners, Saffron. We tend the earth, we do not own it. Love is a luxury for those who can afford to be hungry." Chapter 8. The mahogany door to Lady Beatrix Sterling's study didn't so much open as it surrendered, swinging back to reveal a room that felt less like a place of business and more like a mausoleum for living things. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and a heavy, cloying musk that clung to the velvet draperies, which were drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Beatrix sat behind a desk of polished ebony, her spine a rigid line that mirrored the geometry of the room. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she continued to write with a silver-nibbed pen, the scratching of the ink on parchment, the only sound in the oppressive silence. "Sit, Mr. Al-Rashid," she said, her voice a thin blade of forced kindness. She finally looked up, her eyes two cold chips of flint. She didn't gesture to the chair so much as she acknowledged its existence. "I have spent the morning reviewing the budget for the archives. It is a precarious thing, is it not? The fragility of paper, the volatility of funding. One misplaced decimal, one sudden change in patronage, and a lifetime of scholarship vanishes into the ether." Hassan felt the familiar urge to adjust his glasses, but he forced his hands to remain still at his sides. The room felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. "The restoration is progressing, my lady. The genealogy records are—" "I am not interested in the progress of the ink," Beatrix interrupted, the clip of her words sharp enough to draw blood. She set the pen down with a precise click. "I am interested in the progress of your associations. It has come to my attention that you have developed a most peculiar habit of frequenting the garden of the late Mr. Thorne. A widow's garden is a place for mourning, not for the leisure of a returning scholar. It is a boundary that should not be crossed, not only for the sake of propriety, but for the stability of your own position here." Hassan shifted, the fabric of his coat feeling suddenly too tight across his shoulders. "Miss Thorne is a childhood acquaintance, and her knowledge of the local flora is indispensable to the—" "Do not mistake my patience for ignorance," Beatrix said, her head tilting in that slight, judgmental manner that suggested he was a specimen under a microscope. She leaned forward, the movement slow and predatory. "Let us be excruciatingly clear. You are here by my grace. The funds that keep those archives from rotting into mulch are mine. My connections in London, the curators at the British Museum, the Fellows of the Royal Society, they all answer to the sterling name. Should I decide that your presence in this village is no longer an asset, I can ensure that your academic career is not merely paused, but erased. You would find yourself a pariah in every library from here to Oxford." Hassan felt a cold numbness creep from his fingertips up his arms. The threat was not a blunt instrument. It was a surgical strike. His life's work, the years spent in dusty vaults, the obsessive pursuit of lost texts, the very identity he had forged in the absence of a family, was balanced on the edge of this woman's whim. He watched the ebony desk, the silver pen, the suffocating velvet, and he saw the bars of a cage. If he complied, he would save the archives. He would save his name. He would simply have to excise Saffron from his heart, as if she were a corrupted line of text in an ancient manuscript. He stood in the silence for a moment, his mind racing through the logic of survival. Is a career worth the silence of a soul, he wondered? He thought of the archives, the smell of old vellum, and the thrill of discovery. Then, unbidden, he remembered the sound of Saffron's voice, that soft, rhythmic cadence that felt like the slow unfolding of a leaf in spring. He remembered the way she tugged at her apron strings when she was unsure, and the way she studied a flower not as a specimen, but as a secret. The realization hit him with a physical force. The archives were dead things, preserved in salt and ink, but Saffron was alive. To choose the library over her would be to choose the curator's case over the garden. "I see," Hassan said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "Your terms are quite explicit." "They are," Beatrix replied, already returning her attention to her papers, the dismissal implicit in the movement. "I trust you have the sense to prioritize your future over a momentary lapse in judgment. You may go." Hassan exited the study, but he did not return to the archives. Instead, he walked with a feverish intensity toward the edge of the village, his boots crunching on the gravel. He spent the remainder of the evening in a state of focused agitation. He did not reach for his books or his paleography tools. Instead, he went to the potting shed, his hands shaking as he gripped the handle of a heavy iron spade. He began to dig, not with the precision of a scholar, but with the desperation of a man who had just burned his only bridge and found he liked the heat of the fire. He spent hours in the damp earth, gathering the most provocative specimens he could find. He bypassed the modest daisies and the cautious lilies. He sought the riotous, the forbidden, the explicit. He gathered deep, blood-red roses, their thorns tearing at his palms. He sought out the tangled, exotic passion flowers that looked like crowns of fire. He added sprigs of red hyacinth and the bold, unapologetic crimson of the gladiolus. He worked through the twilight, the dirt staining his cuffs and his fingernails, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was no longer translating a dead language. He was inventing a new one. By the time the moon had climbed high over the valley, Hassan had constructed a floral arrangement that was less a bouquet and more a scream. It was a chaotic, vivid explosion of red and purple, a violent contrast to the muted grays and greens of the garden path. He placed the arrangement directly beneath Saffron's window, where the moonlight would hit the crimson petals and make them glow like embers. In the secret language of floriography, it was an admission of everything, passion, longing, and a total, reckless devotion that ignored every rule of the ton. As he stepped back to survey his work, his chest heaving, he felt a sudden, chilling sensation of being watched. He looked up toward the Sterling Manor, perched on the hill like a vulture. There, on the high stone balcony, stood the silhouette of Lady Beatrix. She was a dark smudge against the pale stone, and even from this distance he could see the rhythmic, slow motion of her hand. She was tapping her fan against her palm, a slow, murderous beat that sounded, in his mind, like a gavel coming down. He had done it. He had traded the security of his profession, the respect of his peers, and the stability of his future for a collection of dying stems and a gamble on a woman who might still be terrified of the world. He studied the red roses, then back at the balcony, and realized that the war for the village had shifted. He was no longer a guest or a scholar. He was a combatant. He stood in the dirt, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, waiting for the dawn to reveal whether Saffron would see the flowers as a lifeline or a liability. Chapter 9. The dew had not yet evaporated from the grass when Saffron pushed open the casement window, the hinges giving a sharp, rusted protest that echoed through the morning stillness. She froze. Below her, resting against the damp stone of the cottage wall, lay a riot of color that looked as though a piece of a tropical jungle had been violently transplanted into the gray English dawn. The red roses were not the polite pale pinks of a tea garden. They were the color of fresh arterial blood, deep and bruising. Beside them, the passion flowers curled like exotic crowns, their intricate filaments reaching upward, paired with the unapologetic, jagged spears of crimson gladiolus. Saffron's breath hitched, her fingers tightening on the wooden sill until the grain bit into her skin. She did not need to consult a lexicon. She had been raised in the dirt and the scent of crushed stems. This was not a gesture of friendship, nor a tentative inquiry of affection. This was a scream. It was a reckless, public declaration of a passion so absolute that it bordered on the sacrilegious. Hassan had not merely spoken to her, he had thrown his entire reputation into the mud at her feet. A sudden, dizzying warmth flooded her chest, a feeling of being seen, truly seen, that made her feel dangerously exposed. For a moment, the world narrowed to the scent of those roses, a heavy, cloying perfume that drowned out the smell of old paper and mourning wool. Saffron. The voice was a rough snap that shattered the silence. Saffron recoiled from the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned to find her father, Balthazar, standing in the doorway. He was not wearing his gardening smock, but his formal coat, the wool frayed at the cuffs. His face, usually a map of weathered contentment, was drawn and grim, his knuckles rubbing together in a slow, anxious friction. He didn't look at her. He studied the floor, his gaze fixed on a loose floorboard. "What has happened, father?" Saffron asked, her voice sounding thin and distant to her own ears. She instinctively reached for her apron strings, tugging them tight, a physical attempt to anchor herself. "Lady Beatrix," Balthazar said, his voice dropping an octave. "She has sent word through the steward. The library cottages are to be cleared. She claims the restoration requires specialized quarters for the visiting consultants from London. You are to vacate by the end of the month, Saffron. She is exercising her right as the primary patron." The room seemed to tilt. Saffron felt the air vanish from the space, replaced by a cold, suffocating vacuum. The library cottages were not merely housing. They were the perimeter of her sanctuary, the only place where the village's judgmental eyes could not reach her. To be evicted was to be cast out into the open, a widow with no protector and a dwindling purse, entirely at the mercy of a woman who viewed her as a smudge on a polished mirror. The joy of the flowers evaporated, replaced by a crushing sense of guilt. Hassan had risked everything for her, and in return the world was closing in. "She cannot simply throw me out," Saffron whispered, though she knew the legalities of the estate were a labyrinth designed to trap people like her. "She can," Balthazar replied, finally looking at her. His eyes were clouded with a mixture of pity and frustration. "And she will. Unless you find a way to make yourself indispensable to her, or a way to leave this village entirely. The seasonal assembly is in 2 weeks, Saffron. Once the guest lists are finalized and the social order is reset, there will be no one left to plead your case. You will be a ghost in your own home." Balthazar left her then, his footsteps heavy and slow, leaving a silence that felt like a physical weight. Saffron did not cry. Instead, she walked out into the garden, her movements mechanical. She bypassed the neatly trimmed hedges and the orderly beds of lavender, drifting toward the wilder edges of the plot. The sky began to bruise, shifting from a pale gray to a heavy, oppressive indigo. Then the rain began. Not a gentle mist, but a sudden, violent downpour that soaked through her thin cotton dress in seconds. She collapsed onto the damp earth, her knees sinking into the loam. She didn't move as the rain washed the salt from her cheeks. She lay there, the scent of crushed mint and wet soil filling her nostrils, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She thought of the red roses beneath her window and the sheer, terrifying bravery of the man who had placed them there. Hassan had stepped out of the shadows of the archives to stand in the light, and she, in her terror, had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing. She realized then that her silence had not been a shield, it had been a shroud. By refusing to fight, she had made herself an easy target for Beatrix's cruelty. "You look remarkably like a drowned rat, Saffron. It is a bold-fashioned choice, even for a widow." Saffron bolted upright, wiping mud from her forehead. Nalini stood under a wide, black silk umbrella, her expression a mixture of amusement and sharp intensity. She didn't offer a hand to help Saffron up. Instead, she stood there, a pillar of poise amidst the chaos of the storm. "I have lost everything," Saffron said, her voice shaking. "The cottage, the gardens, Beatrix has won." Nalini stepped closer, the umbrella tilting to shield Saffron from the worst of the deluge. "Beatrix hasn't won. She has merely defined the board. You are playing a game of propriety and submission, and you are losing because you are actually trying to follow the rules. The rules were written by women like Beatrix to ensure that women like you never leave the dirt." "I cannot fight her," Saffron whispered, looking down at her muddy hands. "I don't have the voice for it." "Then stop using your voice," Nalini countered, her eyes flashing. "You are the most skilled botanist in this county. You speak a language that Beatrix cannot translate, but will certainly feel. If you want to survive the assembly, you cannot go as a supplicant. You cannot go as the grieving widow begging for her home. You must go as a threat." Nalini reached into her pocket and produced a cream-colored envelope. The invitation to the seasonal assembly, embossed with the sterling crest. She dropped it onto the wet grass between them. The assembly is where the village's social hierarchy is cemented for the year. It is a theater of performance. If you wish to keep your sanctuary, you must give the audience a performance they will never forget. Saffron looked at the invitation, then at the dark, rain-slicked garden around her. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it a spark of something else had ignited. It was a hot, sharp defiance, born from the realization that there was nothing left to lose. She thought of Hassan's red roses, the violence of their color, the audacity of their placement. He had stopped translating the past and had begun to write the present. Slowly, Saffron stood up. She ignored the mud clinging to her skirts and the chill in her limbs. She turned away from the cottage and walked toward the furthest, most overgrown corner of the garden, where the plants grew thick and rebellious. She began to move through the brush, her eyes searching not for the elegant or the refined, but for the subversive. She sought the monkshood with its poisonous elegance, the nightshade with its deceptive berries, and the deep, bruised purples of the black hellebore. She didn't gather them with the care of a gardener, she harvested them with the precision of an armorer. As she tied the stems together with a piece of rough twine, she felt the shift in her own spirit. She was no longer assembling a bouquet, she was constructing a weapon. She would attend the assembly, and she would bring with her a floral arrangement that would strip the mask of propriety from Lady Beatrix's face in front of the entire ton. The silence was over. The war had begun. Chapter 10. The Sterling Ballroom was a study in monochrome restraint. The walls were a pale, suffocating cream, and the guests moved like slow-motion ghosts in a sea of muted grays, pale blues, and the heavy, oppressive blacks of those still performing their grief. At the center of this curated stillness stood Beatrix Sterling, her spine a rigid line of steel, her gaze sweeping the room with the clinical precision of a general inspecting a failing garrison. She held her fan with a grip that suggested she might use it to strike anyone who dared breathe out of tempo, her head tilted at that familiar judgmental angle that reduced every guest to a mere curiosity in her collection. Saffron did not enter the room so much as she disrupted it. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and for a heartbeat, the music, a timid string quartet playing something predictably safe, seemed to falter. Saffron was not wearing the charcoal silk of a widow, nor the subdued lavender of a woman seeking forgiveness. She wore a gown of deep, mossy green that clung to her frame with a quiet strength, but it was the arrangement pinned to her bodice and trailing from her wrist that froze the room. It was a violent, beautiful collision of botany, the bruised midnight purple of black hellebore, the poisonous elegance of monkshood, and the searing, arrogant red of roses that looked as though they had been plucked from a fever dream. It was not a bouquet, it was a manifesto written in petals and thorns. As Saffron crossed the polished marble floor, the silence rippled outward from her like a stone cast into a stagnant pond. The gasps were not loud, for propriety forbade such things, but they were visceral, sharp intakes of breath that sounded like a collective shudder. The guests leaned away from her, as if the arrangement were contagious. Hassan, standing near the periphery of the room, did not move. His glasses caught the light of the chandeliers, and his posture, usually so hesitant, suddenly mirrored Saffron's own. He did not look at the crowd, he looked only at her, his expression one of profound, terrified admiration. Beatrix Sterling's fan stopped its rhythmic tapping. The sound of its closure was like a pistol shot in the sudden vacuum of the room. She stepped forward, the silk of her gown hissing against the floor, her face a mask of forced kindness that failed to reach her eyes. "My dear Saffron," Beatrix said, her voice a clipped, high-altitude wind, "I see you have mistaken the seasonal assembly for a village fair. This display is remarkably vulgar. One wonders if your grief has finally clouded your judgment, or if you simply find the concept of station so tedious that you've decided to abandon it entirely. It is entirely unbecoming of a woman in your position." Saffron stopped 3 feet from the matriarch. She did not tug at her apron strings, for she wore no apron, and she did not look at the floor. She looked directly into Beatrix's eyes, her gaze steady and clear. When she spoke, the softness was gone, replaced by a rhythmic cadence that carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Position is a curious thing, Lady Beatrix," Saffron replied, her voice resonating with a strength that seemed to surprise even herself. "You speak of station as if it were a mountain we are born upon, rather than a fence you have built to keep others out. This arrangement is not vulgar, it is honest. The monkshood speaks of caution, the hellebore of scandal, and the roses. Well, the roses speak of a truth that does not require your permission to exist." Beatrix's lip curled, her fan tightening in her hand. "You are overstepping, Saffron. You are a guest in this village by the grace of the patronage that sustains your late husband's name." "Patronage," Saffron countered, stepping closer, the scent of the bruised flowers filling the space between them. "Is that what you call the systematic erasure of our history?" "I have seen the archives, Beatrix. I have seen the letters you suppressed and the records you pruned to ensure the Sterling name remained the only one of consequence. You did not preserve the library, you curated a mirror. You have spent years silencing the voices of this village to ensure your own voice is the only one that echoes. You call my flowers vulgar, yet there is nothing more vulgar than a lie dressed in silk." The room shifted. It was a subtle movement at first, a tilt of a head here, a whispered confidence there, but the power dynamic had fundamentally fractured. The guests were no longer looking at Saffron as a social pariah. They were looking at Beatrix as a fraud. The propriety Beatrix had used as a weapon for decades was suddenly revealed for what it was, a cage designed to protect her own fragility. The silence that followed was no longer one of respect, but of a slow, creeping ridicule. Hassan moved then. He did not hesitate or glance toward the exit. He walked through the crowd, his stride purposeful, and came to a stop beside Saffron. In a gesture that shattered every remaining rule of the evening, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers in a public, undeniable claim. He knew that by doing so, he was forfeiting the academic endorsements Beatrix controlled, tossing his prestige into the fire for the sake of a woman who spoke in flowers. "I find the arrangement exquisite," Hassan said, his voice formal but infused with a warmth that made the room feel cold. "It is the first honest thing I have seen in this house." Beatrix stood frozen. Her face had gone a ghastly shade of gray, the color of the dresses she had forced upon the room. She studied their joined hands, then at the faces of her peers, and realized that the theater of her power had collapsed. The audience had stopped believing in the play. In a sudden, spasmodic motion, her hand tightened too far, and there was a sharp, dry snaps. The delicate ivory ribs of her fan splintered, the silk tearing down the middle. She stood there, clutching the broken remains of her authority, a figure of sudden, pathetic isolation in the center of her own ballroom. 2 weeks later, the silence of the library gardens was no longer a shield, but a celebration. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and reckless growth. The meticulously manicured hedges of the Sterling era had been allowed to soften, their edges blurring into a riot of unconventional colors. Foxgloves surged upward in towering spires of speckled crimson, and climbing nightbloom scent draped itself over the stone arches like a living curtain. Saffron stood by the central fountain, her hands stained with the dark rich loam of the beds. She was wearing a simple linen dress, her hair escaping its pins in a way that would have horrified the assembly. Beside her, Hassan was reading a restored manuscript, though he spent more time looking at Saffron than the vellum. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in shards of gold and emerald, dancing across the pages of his book. He closed the volume and stepped toward her, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. He didn't speak, he simply reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Saffron leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. They stood together in the center of the wildness, two people who had traded the safety of the shore for the uncertainty of the current. Around them, the garden continued to bloom. Not in the disciplined rows of a curated exhibition, but in the beautiful, chaotic surge of something that had finally been allowed to breathe,